I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. Blake Stephenson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I rise on Flood Action Week to raise an issue which is front of mind for so many of my constituents in mid-Bedfordshire. Flooding in September devastated homes, farms, businesses right across my constituency and the constituencies of honourable friends across Bedfordshire. Indeed, my home in Shillington was flooded. With 2 months of rainfall in 24 hours causing considerable damage to property and risks for people, especially the elderly or vulnerable, I want to begin by thanking all the first responders and council workers who worked tirelessly to support my constituents. I'll give way.
Thank the Honourable Member for Mid-Bedfordshire for giving way, and I congratulate him on securing this adjournment debate during Flood Action Week. And as the MP for Luton South and South Bedfordshire, I too had constituents impacted by the flooding across the county. And last week I met with representatives from the Fire Brigades Union who said that over 400 calls in 7 hours had been taken in relation to flood-related issues alone in that period. So I'd like to pay tribute to them also. And does he agree with me that there should be absolute recognition of firefighters who carry out their rescue during flooding, because it's not actually a statutory service and they do this alongside all their other statutory duties?
I thank the member for Luton South and South Bedfordshire for her remarks. So many people across so many organisations work tirelessly, including Fire and Rescue, to protect our communities, and I associate myself with her comments on the support provided by our local police, fire and rescue services. Mid-Bedfordshire is not an area of obvious risk from extreme flooding. Unlike colleagues in other parts of the county, we lack major rivers beyond the River Flit. But our soil types range from the thin, sandy soils of the Green Sand Ridge to poorly draining clay soils, each presenting their own flooding challenges. Our winters are getting wetter, and I know that many families like mine will be looking at the damage done by these floods and worry that flooding like this will become the norm. I'll give way.
I'm very, very grateful. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very grateful to my colleague from Mid-Bedfordshire, and again, congratulate him for securing this important debate for residents of Bedfordshire. He talks about not having rivers in his constituency. In North Bedfordshire, we're blessed with 2 rivers, and the issues of flooding, although this was an extreme event, have been persistent in places like Harold and Clapham and at Great Barford, and most recently and quite devastating in Tempsford and Boston in my constituency. Does he welcome the initiative taken up now by the Mayor of Bedford, Tom Wootton, to get a comprehensive approach from all of the different agencies that can help residents with their flood response, and that this is something that's a model for how we should look at future flood risk assessments in Bedfordshire?
I thank the member for North Bedfordshire for those remarks, and I absolutely agree. And I would love to join any of those meetings with Mayor Tom to support those efforts in my wards of Wixham's and Wootton.
Further to that point?
Yes, I'll give way.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I commend the Honourable Gentleman for Mid-Bedfordshire for bringing this forward? I spoke to him beforehand, and one of the frustrations that sometimes people have is in relation to the coordination between the different government departments that the Honourable Gentleman who had been before spoke to. Does he feel that one of the things to improve the issues on behalf of constituents would be better coordination in relation to flooding of roads so that they know in advance, better coordination when it comes to the flooding of housing and housing development areas as well, and thirdly, for many people, it may just be the simple thing of having a sandbag available, that they need to be there, and people need to know those things. Maybe that would help.
I thank the member for those comments. I think one of the lessons that certainly I've learned from the flooding in mid-Bedfordshire is there are many statutory bodies involved in flooding response and flooding resilience. I think we need to work harder to make sure those organisations work together. That is why it's so important that government, local authorities and others learn the right lessons from these floods, and I hope this debate can play a role in guiding that conversation. First, let me reflect on the direct impact on constituents in mid-Bedfordshire. Hundreds of residents have taken the time to describe for me the huge losses that they have suffered, and I thank them for taking the time to do that whilst also trying to recover from flood damage themselves. Emma from Marston Mortain filled in my recent flood survey and told me that our property was completely soaked front to back. We saw water rise, and beside the path at our house there was gushing water. We had to call for help. Water came in through the sides, the foundations, and in the end there was nothing we could do. Caroline from Flitwick also took the time to share her experience. Severe flooding of my property requiring full water removal from my house and severe repairs. And Caroline is currently staying with family but having to relocate for a minimum of 6 months whilst repairs are done. And Rita from Harlington explained that We had internal flooding start at 9:30 a.m. with sewage coming up from a manhole cover in our garage. We contacted Anglian Water by 10 a.m. We couldn't shower or flush the toilet as it was gurgling back up. Then the rains came. The front drive was a deluge. We had neighbours helping with buckets and pumps trying to get the water off our property. It was a fighting battle. The water reached our front door and came into our property. Being flooded is not just an inconvenience. It's an expensive and heartbreaking for families to see their valuables, some irreplaceable, washed away. Shortly after the flooding, I took the time to visit dozens of local businesses, including Discolicious in Gravenhurst, Malden Garden Centre and the Doghouse Daycare Centre, also in Malden. They have, together with many other businesses, all experienced severe financial losses, and in some cases they've seen many years of hard work and investment washed away before their eyes. And some of the worst hit have been our farmers, with severe and significant flooding reported at several local farms, including at the Mortain Retreat, a small holding which has been impacted hugely by floodwaters flowing from the A41. In the aftermath of this flooding, I've learned that 74% of the UK's floodplain is agricultural land. Flooding can decimate whole crop yields, destroying months of work and threatening the livelihoods of our farmers, in many cases at the same time as seeing their homes devastated by floodwaters.
I wonder if my honourable friend can give way.
Yes, I'll give way then.
I'm extremely grateful to my honourable friend giving way, and as he mentions landowners and farmers, he'll be well aware of the work of the internal drainage boards, which do such vital work in protecting land and require resources to do so. The previous government committed 75 million to drainage boards, but we've yet to see it delivered by the current administration, as well as which we need a long-term solution to the funding of IDBs so that local authorities don't put under undue pressure and have to fund them themselves.
I thank the honourable member for that point, and actually he stole my thunder because that exact point was later on in my speech. So I shall skip over that when we get to it. So I'll say it again, perhaps. England has suffered its second worst harvest on record with persistent wet weather, and waterlogged fields risk putting our farmers out of business over the medium to long term. I'll give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and he's making an excellent speech. And just building on that point, many of our farmers, not only across Bedfordshire but across the whole of the country, are facing their second serious crop losses in a growing period. And does my right honourable friend agree with me that it's incredibly frustrating that despite the last Conservative government allocating £50 million through the Farm Recovery Fund, that many farmers who urgently need this money that was guaranteed to get out of the door are not yet receiving this from the new administration?
I thank the member for those contributions. It is exactly that. It's very frustrating. And I know constituents who farm in my constituency are incredibly frustrated that funding will not be made available. The persistent wet weather is not only a disaster for those farmers, it's a disaster for all of us because it impacts yield and quality, resulting in higher food prices and threats to national food security. The government needs to take action, recognising that farmers in Bedfordshire are business people too, but that they are providing a public benefit by taking flooding that would otherwise flow into our towns and villages. I hope the Minister will work with colleagues to design a scheme to properly recognise and remunerate the contribution our farmers make in allowing their fields to flood. Our local councils, and as a councillor I should refer members to my register of interests, have done some fantastic work to support residents, having been forced to pick up the pieces and the bill to manage this response and to now put things right. They've not got everything right, far from it, but they've stepped up during this emergency and they've provided significant resources to keep people, particularly the most vulnerable, safe. But our households, businesses, farmers and councils now need the government to step up and do its bit by releasing funds to support our communities to recover and improve resilience. The Minister has discretion here, and I was surprised to receive a response to a written question this afternoon suggesting that this flooding was not at a sufficient scale to be considered as exceptional enough to release recovery funding. Perhaps the Minister will address that in her closing remarks. I'm concerned that the government fails to appreciate the significant but localised impact of this particular flooding event, and my constituents want and deserve support. The most high-profile victim of our recent flooding was perhaps the A421. It was closed for weeks after more than 60 million litres of water collected in a dip in the road at Marston Mortain. National Highways have worked hard and around the clock to reopen the road, but as we look at lessons learned, significant questions must be asked as to how we got here. How a major A road connecting Bedford to the M1, built this century, can have been built down into the ground in a historic floodplain, which of course is prone to flooding. It was designed in such a way that it regularly floods a little, but was also built with flood mitigations insufficient to deal with the kind of flooding that could become all too common in the years ahead. As this government looks to build similar infrastructure in the years ahead, we must heed the warnings of the A421 and build in a way that is protected not from the flooding of yesterday, but the flooding of tomorrow. But roads are not the only area where problems with effective infrastructure have exacerbated the impact of flooding on my residents in mid-Bedfordshire. Blocked drains reported right across mid-beds in places like Lower Shelton, Flitwick, Cranfield, Harlington and Malden significantly increase the likelihood of surface water flooding. And clearing drains regularly, if not the sole solution, to my constituents represents common sense and a quick answer to mitigate at least some of the risks. They want to see the schedule of maintenance improved materially. Leaves fall every autumn and block drains, not every 3 years. And utility companies dig up roads and fill drains with mud and tarmac, only to leave them to be cleared by the council in its 3-yearly cycle. This simply is not good enough, and it is putting property and lives at risk. I therefore call on the government to urgently consider introducing a new statutory duty on local authorities to clear drains and culverts regularly, backed by central funding at the budget to ensure that councils have the resources they need. I also urge the government, and this is my honourable friend's point, to look at the way internal drainage boards are funded to ensure that they have the resources they need to manage local flood risks. And I ask the Minister to commit to meet with me and interested colleagues to discuss how that might be achieved.
Will the Honourable Member give way?
I give way.
Thank you. In Leicestershire, we have a lot of landowners who should be doing more to help alleviate flooding. Unfortunately, local authorities have very limited powers to enforce them, compel them to act. Does he agree with me that actually more needs to be done to bolster the power of local flood authorities that are invariably upper-tier councils?
I thank the honourable member for that intervention, and I agree that this is something the government should be looking at. During the recent flooding, I was appalled to learn that drains and sewers in the new town of Wixhams were overloaded with surface floodwater. 17 years after construction began in Wixhams, the drainage infrastructure should be adequate to accommodate many more houses than have currently been built. And I urge the Minister to join me in pressing Anglian Water to take urgent action to expand the sewage and drainage infrastructure. But Wixhams is merely the most obvious example of a problem that residents are seeing repeatedly with development. House by house, development by development, infrastructure is failing to keep pace. While an individual development might not be enough to overwhelm the system or cause knock-on flooding impacts, the accumulated weight of development is creating huge problems across the country, including Malden, in my constituency, where development has crept gradually up the slope of the Greensand Ridge, resulting in water having fewer places to stop and soak, so instead it surges down into the village. Whilst the flooding infrastructure for these new developments might, in theory, be sufficient to planners to justify development, planning is failing to cope with the demands placed on it by multiple and interconnected developments, which is piling pressure onto networks and our natural environment. With the government set to review the planning system and ask our towns and villages to take thousands of additional homes, I implore the Minister to work with colleagues to deliver reforms that require flooding authorities to take a wider systems view of the impacts of development. We need to ensure that housing targets do not put the delivery of new homes over the habitability of housing stock or the safety and sustainability of our communities. I will give way.
The Honourable Member for giving way, and also for securing such an important debate for constituents in his constituency, but also all of us here representing Bedfordshire seats. The point he's making is a really important one and is felt keenly by my residents in Langford on Southlands Rise, where the failure of flood prevention measures put in place as part of the new development meant that several of them had catastrophic flooding in a very short space of time over the last few weeks. Will he share my view that not only is consideration of flooding risk through local and national planning frameworks clearly in need of review, but we also need to make sure that measures are in place for robust enforcement to ensure that the flooding mitigation measures that are put in place in new developments actually work as they said they should?
I thank the member for Hitchin for his intervention, and that story is a story that's felt and heard all across Mid-Bedfordshire too, and I do agree with the points that have been made. As a starting point, I'd like the government also to consider urgently introducing secondary legislation to bring into effect Schedule 3 of the Flood and Water Management Act 2010. And the Minister smiles, so perhaps has a point to make on that in wind-up. Whilst I understand from a recent answer to my written question that the Minister wants to be mindful of the impact of over-regulation on developers, building homes that increase flooding risk in our towns and villages does nothing to help alleviate the housing crisis. I must also consider the benefits of nature and nature-based solutions. Natural upstream solutions would help capture water and absorb some of the worst impacts of flooding. The Bedford to Milton Keynes Waterway Park is a great local example of a project which has the potential to remove water during flooding and indeed deliver water when it's most needed during droughts, and we must press ahead and deliver that at pace. In addition, we need the government to look again at its plans to designate inferior quality areas of the countryside for development and instead commit to a bold strategy of restoring nature and in so doing creating natural flood defences for our towns and villages. And in our towns and villages themselves, I would like the government to commit to a natural regeneration programme using trees and nature to create sponge cities by enhancing drainage to prevent surface water flooding. I will conclude with a final lesson that I hope the Minister will reflect upon. My constituents were disappointed that whilst the Minister took the time to visit those in nearby Leighton Buzzard to observe the impacts of flooding there, our towns and villages in Mid-Bedfordshire received no attention from the government at all. With a major road closed and a substantial number of houses and businesses impacted, had the flooding in Mid-Bedfordshire been concentrated in a single major urban area, I've no doubt that we might have attracted some specific focus. I've raised questions with the Minister and the Department which remain unanswered. I would urge the government to remember that rural areas are impacted by flooding too, and that they should be properly served by this government, not an afterthought. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Minister Emma Hardy.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to see you sitting there in the chair. And I'd like to thank the member for Mid-Bedfordshire for calling the debate on this important matter, and indeed everybody who has contributed and intervened during the discussion. And I'd like to start by sincerely expressing my sympathies for all those homes and businesses and individuals impacted by flooding. I might have shared with the House before the impacts on 2007 when the city that I represent was flooded, and I was teaching at the time, and it's maybe a story for another day, but how the flood water came in and we had to evacuate it, and the devastating impacts this had on people for a long time afterwards, including impacting their mental health. So I'm very sympathetic to the honourable gentleman for being a victim of flooding himself. I realise that's really not easy at all. And as he's mentioned, over 1,000 properties were flooded following recent heavy rain across central and southern England, and the effects particularly felt in the communities in Bedfordshire, Northamptonshire, Oxfordshire, Shropshire, Buckinghamshire and North West London. But over 22,000 properties were protected by existing flood defences. And as mentioned, I visited the Leighton Buzzard area in Bedfordshire on the 26th of September to meet volunteers and local residents to see firsthand the impact of the flooding there. And I know that many people are now facing months of disruption and upset. And I was particularly struck by one of the ladies that I met there who was in tears when I went into her home, showing me what was her beautiful home that she'd lived in for over 20 years, spent a lot of time on, and how it had just been ruined by the floodwater coming in, and she found that absolutely devastating. And he's right to point out how this impacts vulnerable people. Heard stories of an elderly lady having to be rescued and taken away from her home, and absolutely pay tribute to the services of fire, Humber, not just Humber, fire and rescue, I'm so used to saying Humberside, and the service that they do working and rescuing people. And I'd also like to thank the Honourable Member for joining the call that we did with the Environment Agency. This is something new that I've tried since being Minister, because it would be impossible for me to visit everywhere. That is simply the case. So if I can find other ways to be as open and accessible as possible, which is why we tried this call. We had about 50 members of Parliament on the call, and it was a way for you to be able to get, for honourable members to be able to get that information directly from the Environment Agency. So I'm grateful he joined it, of course.
It's a forgiving way, and we've worked together when she was on this side of the House, and so I know she is true to her word. My honourable friend very nobly, I thought, suggested that we ought to have a meeting about IDBs. It's a critically important issue for so many parts of the country, and a small delegation of colleagues, I'm sure, could, in the spirit that the Minister just described, have a very productive discussion. I wonder if you'd agree to that.
He's so difficult to say no to, isn't he, Madam Deputy Speaker? How infuriating. I've experienced this before. Yes, we will. That'd be fine. I'm attending the conference, the International Drainage Board conference, so probably after I've attended conference, met with the people there, happy to meet with a delegation to talk about IDBs. And I can already hear my my private office saying, you've agreed to another meeting, Minister, and telling me off. Yes.
Yes, I've been there.
I was part of that call to which she referred. On September the 30th, I'm an MP in Somerset and we requested a meeting. We have the benefit of the Somerset Rivers Authority, which is unique in the country, I believe. But it is certainly, we need to wrestle with how we enable the Environment Agency, the Internal Drainage Board, the Council, the Rivers Authority and every other agency to actually address the problem of flooding for people in Somerset also. May I ask her to ensure her officials make that meeting happen, please?
Absolutely. I mean, as you'll be aware, the flooding happens during recess, so it's just been 1 week back, but it's all noted down, and if I make a promise, I stick to it, so we will have that. We will have that. Now, where were we? So, there was also innovation in the incident response for the Environment Agency. I found this quite interesting, but that's perhaps my inner geek coming out. So they launched drone flights over the flooded area to actually look at assessing and monitoring where it had been flooded and looked for where there were blockages and fallen trees in some of the waterways. And then they were able to send people out to remove them because of this use of drones. And I thought that was quite a clever way, especially in large rural areas, of covering as much as possible to see, to see where they needed to solve the problem. But I'd also like to reiterate the government's thanks to the Environment Agency, local responders and many others who work tirelessly to help communities across the country deal with the local floods. And of course, I want to pay tribute to our farmers. This is the worst harvest, I think, 2 years in a row that they faced. And I realise as well the impact that this has had on many of their mental health. I do accept the frustration around the Farming Flood Recovery Fund. I accept the frustration, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to give you an equally frustrating answer, which is until the budget is announced, there's not much more I can say on that matter, but I realise that won't offer them the reassurance they want at the moment. But where I can offer them reassurance is I know the National Farming Union were really keen as well to have a look at how the formula is calculated when it comes to assessing where flood defences are built. At the moment, it's based on number of properties protected. I want to have a look at that formula, and I know this is something they've called for a long time, to see whether that is still the right formula that we need. So that's something I've committed to doing with the NFU. And I would like to pay tribute as well to a few of the volunteer groups that I met in Bedfordshire, including the Bedfordshire Local Emergency Volunteers Executive Committee, particularly a lady called June Tobin and Graham Muntford, who were fantastic. And it was brilliant to see how well the volunteer organisations are embedded in the emergency response by the Bedfordshire Local Resilience Forum. And I was also really impressed by the work of AMIA and what they're doing to get young people involved in volunteering. And there were many young people volunteering at Meadowway Community Centre, and especially 2 impressive young teenage girls who told me that they wanted to come and help in the community, and they were there making tea and coffee for everybody. And I thought they deserved a special mention in my speech this evening. And I'm sure the Honourable Member as well found many wonderful examples of people helping. And has been mentioned, it is Flood Action Week, and what a week to be talking about flooding. And if you'll indulge me for a moment, I just want to kind of reiterate a few safety messages around Flood Action Week. So we're urging the public to know and understand their flood risk, and please sign up for flood alerts. If there's one thing each of us as Member of Parliament can do, it's encourage our constituents to sign up for flood alerts, because if they have the time, then that means they can get prepared. One of the other things we'd like them to do is looking at preparing a flood kit, having your medication in there, having the essentials if you're going to be away from home or asked to evacuate at short notice, as well as thinking about what's going to happen with pets. And the Environment Agency have got extensive guidance on what we can do to try and improve our flood resilience as well. And there was an event today, which I hope many members were able to attend, which was the Environment Agency and Flood Re's parliamentary drop-in. If people were unable to attend this, I'm sure they can email out the information for you to communicate with constituents. And I want to reassure the honourable member that flooding is one of DEFRA's 5 key priorities. The honest truth is we've inherited flood defences at their worst record since 2010. The condition of the key flood defences in England is at 92%. This is the lowest it has been in 14 years, which is clearly concerning. As has been mentioned, we are going into another wet winter. Because of this, we've been able to move £36 million extra into urgent repair of some of these flood defences. And we've also got mobile assets. So we've got 275 mobile pumps. We've got 25 kilometres of flood defences as well. And by using sort of knowledge around long-term forecasts, we want to get these mobile resources into the areas required. But it's definitely far from ideal. The previous government's flood investment programme was unfortunately behind schedule and over budget. I'm urgently reviewing it to make sure that we have a flood programme fit for the purpose, and as been mentioned, I've been looking at how the formula works. And the Honourable mentioned one of my favourite words, which was SUDS, which only people sort of in this level of geekery get excited about. Sustainable Urban Drainage Systems, very good. And Schedule 3 of the 2010, and I'm pleased he pointed out as well it was 2010 and it still hasn't actually been enacted. It is really important that we look at sustainable urban drainage. At the moment, as he's mentioned, MHCLG are doing a whole review into planning and how the planning system works, and it will come as no surprise to him that I'm obviously pushing from the DEFRA end of things on how we can ensure that the homes we build are flood-proof for now and the future, and importantly, don't contribute or add to flood risk within the area, which I think are 2 important issues. And of course, the priority for the Honourable Member is his constituency, bearing in mind, of course, that water is one of those tricky things that does not obey constituencies, does not obey nations, and therefore, as has been pointed out, if we want to tackle flooding, sometimes the answer is further upstream, quite literally, when it comes to flooding and looking at some of the solutions. And I did enjoy hearing him mention natural flood management solutions as well, which is another thing I get very excited about, because we have a nature crisis, and if we can deliver something that not only delivers protection for flooding, but also increases nature, then isn't that a wonderful thing to do? I'm a huge fan. I don't think the answer to everything should always be concrete. However, at times, of course, we do need to have those hard flood defences. So looking at a catchment-based approach, how we can sort of handle this, where we can look in some areas at slowing the flow, where we can move it out more quickly in others, is very important. And he also mentioned the A421. I was stuck on that A road, Madam Deputy Speaker, as well. So after visiting the flooded area in Leighton Buzzard, realising I couldn't then get a lift back to London, because at the time, I think it was at Euston Station was shut, ended up trying to get a lift from someone up to Peterborough to get my way back up to Hull, and stuck on a diversion of the A412. So I feel his pain, can I just say, as being a fellow victim of that particular closed road. And in terms of Bedfordshire itself, the Environment Agency estimate 3.5 million are going to be invested in increasing flood resilience. And many of those schemes, because as he quite rightly said, it's surface water. That's the problem. So many of those are going to be small-scale surface water solutions. Am I getting the nod to say, hurry up now, aren't I, Madam Deputy Speaker? OK, right, I'm going to speed on. But we can continue much of this at a later date. But let me move on to conclude. To conclude, I would like to reiterate that this government will act to ensure people are better protected from flooding in the first place. We are determined to turbocharge the delivery and repair of flood defences, improve drainage systems and develop natural flood management solutions. We're investing over £1.25 billion this year to scale up natural resilience through building new and improving existing flood defences. The government is reviewing the existing programme to get it back on track after the slow pace due to the impacts of inflation and delay to the supply chain. The Flood Resilience Task Force, which we set up and has already met, which includes organisations as DEFRA, MHCLG, Home Office, Cabinet Office, Environment Agency, the Met Office, Local Resilient Forums, Mayoral Office, Emergency Responders and the National Farming Union, and we'll be meeting again in January. And emergency services, EA, the local authorities, voluntary organisations and government departments stand ready to support affected communities in any future flooding. Flooding is personal and a priority for me. I will work tirelessly to make our community more resilient to flooding.
Yeah. The question is that this House do now adjourn. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. The ayes have it, the ayes have it. Order, order.